How's it going, fellow scholars? Welcome to Letters to the Cosmere, and welcome to my top 10 things you might have missed in Rhythm of War. This is a sequel to my Oathbringer top 10 things you might have missed. However, that was on my primary channel, The Blue Shifting. This is my Cosmere specific channel because I didn't think it was working out to have my Cosmere stuff mingling with all my visual novel stuff I normally do. I highly recommend you check it out, but this channel is specifically for Cosmere. It's smaller, it's more compact. I've re-uploaded though everything from the first channel, and if it's not here yet, it will be soon, but please stick around if you want more Cosmere content. I have a lot of exciting plans for the 2021 year, and I hope to have more to share with you. But let's jump right into it, because you didn't come here to hear me ramble on about all this. You want to hear some of the spicy things I picked up in the book that you might have overlooked a little bit. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is in the prologue, where we get a clear indication that the Sleepless were directly involved in trying to prevent the treaty from being signed. We know this because in the short novel Dawn Shard, we see that the Sleepless operate by subterfuge, and one of the classic tactics they use to try and dissuade people from doing an action is by poisoning grain, which is something that we see Navani and the cook discussing in the pre-signing chaos of trying to get everything put together, where all their food was tainted by worms, something we saw directly happen in the book and had been noted on other occasions that had happened. So the Sleepless were watching, and they were not fond of what was going on, likely against some of the things Gavilar was attempting to do, potentially with the heralds and the information that they were discussing. So very, very interesting to know they were watching, but obviously they were still in their very passive point of view and passive stance. So whether or not they did more direct involvement in the proceedings of that evening remains to be seen. But we'll keep an eye out for some of those telltale signs, namely skin patterns such as tattoos or other things that can help cover up the fact that people are interacting with are nothing more than a bunch of crabs tied together to look like somebody. Now, point two I want to go to is, well, frankly, it's all over the book, so I'm not going to be able to point to any specific instance, but very early on in the first part, we see that the fused have means of fighting with shard weapons, except they don't contain shards themselves. They have normal lightweight weapons that they are using that can block and defend themselves against shard blades. This is very clearly an aluminum alloy weapon, unless there's something else going on that we haven't seen, but it seems most likely that stuff we've witnessed in other parts of the Cosmere are simply playing a role. Now the question is, are listeners able to craft these alloys with aluminum to make them more ready weapons? Because obviously pure aluminum would make a terrible fighting weapon. Or are they getting information from Scadrians? Potentially, though, it's the reverse. Maybe this is a long time discovery of the fused. Having been able to fight Radiance through time again and again and again, they developed these types of weapons, and perhaps that inspiration is what led to the development of aluminum weapons on Scadrial to make guns and bullets. What makes that very interesting is potentially the idea of somebody bringing over some of those weaponry from Scadrial, since we understand that the timelines between the Way of Kings first story, like the arc of the Stormlight Archive, and Alloy of Law arc are roughly the same point in time in the Cosmere. So, could we see some interesting weapons brought over in Book 5? Unlikely, but at this point I wouldn't be too surprised. Now, one of my favorite things that came about were the openers in part 1 from the Electron Fabrial Mechanics. It's the lecture that Navani's giving about how Fabrials are created. One of the most important things I think we need to glean from this is the fact that they use allomantic metals as ways to enhance design and craft Fabrials. In fact, they follow such similar patterns, it's obviously not a mistake. The mechanics of the 16 metals likely translates into interesting interactions with other sources of investiture because of the invested nature of preservation and ruin into the metals. Now, specifically, there are examples of brass, which is a push metal, being used to suppress the spren inside a gemstone, condensing their effects, and how zinc, which is a pull metal, manifests them more powerfully, more rapidly, at a higher cost of stormlight. So, by suppressing, you can make a Fabrial last longer, though it is weaker, and by pulling, you can make it manifest more strongly, but more expensively. It also mentions others like steel and iron and all other the common metals that influence the ways the Fabrials can work, which makes me wonder exactly what are some of the more advanced allomantic metals like bend alloy able to do in conjunction with Fabrials. It actually makes a very exciting pretense and possibilities to consider, especially because this is not a topic I'm going to be leaving right now, but simply wanted to point out that early on in the book, it became very, very clear that a lot of the mechanical uses of investiture are likely going to lean on metal use, since metals are frequent, they are all over the Cosmere, and they are directly tied to investiture in some way or another. And by studying and understanding the allomantic and ferrochemical charts, we are likely going to be able to have some insight into some of the things that we see being invented around the Cosmere as technology improves. Now, on the subject of Scadrial, which, by the way, was all over this book, in case you didn't notice, I can't see how you wouldn't, but remember, these are all very, very spoilerific, so anything beyond this point is heavily spoiled, though you should have seen a content warning at the beginning of this video. Thydacar. He's the leader of the Ghostbloods. I was suspicious, and I was actually pretty happy that I was able to guess his identity pretty early on, but I mean, come on, the Ghostbloods, the organization, the way they work, their motivations, it just seemed a little too familiar in some ways, and Hoyd, towards the end of the book, calls Thydacar, quote, the Lord of Scars, which obviously can't be anybody else but our favorite survivor who refuses to die even when he's dead, Kelsier. He's still trapped inside the Scadrian system, it seems, because he's too heavily invested. Whether that's because he's a sliver, or a Mistborn, or both, or neither, I'm sure Brandon will clarify if he has not already. I simply want to make sure that you point out, Thydacar is like 99.9% Kelsier, and it's disturbing that he has continued his rampage of doing whatever it takes to bring about whatever he wants to do, and is leading to the likely scenario that Kelsier will become a major villain player in the Cosmere at some point. As Brandon said long ago, that while we all love Kelsier, and Kelsier was very important for rising up against the Lord Ruler, the personality and goal-oriented nature of Kelsier would likely translate into a villain in most other situations. He just happened to be fighting against an oppressive, tyrannical leader at the time. So don't be surprised if Thydacar turns out to be a kind of a douche. Another use of metals. Again, this is going to be a very metal-focused episode because there were so many things that were kind of mentioned but might have been glossed over in the excitement of the book, because the book was very engaging, and let's be honest, there were so many things revealed, it's frankly hard for me to make this list. But another thing that's really important kind of heralds back to my earlier point: the metal in the blades that were used to conduct investiture. These are the blades that have been used so far to assassinate heralds by sucking their soul out. At first I thought those might potentially be hemalurgic spike-like entities, and they still could be, because we know that working through hemalurgy that a Nicrosil hemalurgic spike does steal investiture, which for a herald very likely could work in that way. We've also seen that the Fused have used weapons like these in the past to steal Stormlight, to try and inhibit the healing properties of the Radiance. So we might actually still be looking at that, but we also know that there are other uses for this metal, which makes a lot of sense with Nicrosil in general, because Nicrosil is the metal that conducts investiture. I believe that these knives have a band of metal which we've seen used, manipulated, and flipped to change the direction of the flow of investiture inside the blade, to either go toward the gemstone in the hilt or out of the gemstone into the individual. It makes a lot of sense that this would be Nicrosil. Now, what's interesting is that in the story they call it Brazium, which could mean that it might be a god metal from Braze, but I think it's a little more likely that Nicrosil is just a lot more common, especially in a refined form, on Braze, considering the situations of the entire Rosharan system, and the fact that Nicrosil is likely a metal that is difficult to soulcast and or to find naturally. So, whether or not it's actually a god metal, I'm deferring on the not, but I'm not going to omit the fact that it's possible, because the name Brazium seems a little on the nose for what it could possibly be, but I just don't see it as being Odium's physical metal in any way. One of my favorite parts was that in some of the title headers leading up to this point, we got to learn and confirm the names of several shards. This is really nice. I think Rhythm of War has been a bit of a Brandon info dump, because he's really being able to finally release information that he's been teasing for years now. We now have confirmed names of several of the shards whom we haven't met yet: Invention, Whimsy, Mercy, Valor. Ambition died in the Threnody system. We kind of knew that, but it's now been officially confirmed. and that we always knew there was a second shard there who fled, and we just realized that the name of that is Mercy. So while Threnody has been left with a rift, that's what causes the shades to appear, has to do a lot with the death of ambition, which sounds horrific and terrifying. And in fact, it was such a horrific and terrifying death, it seems that Odium perfected a new way of destroying shards by splintering them rather than flat out destroying them, because apparently even he was a little freaked out by what happened on the Threnody system. But yes, we know Mercy fled and is still around, though likely I find the likelihood of Mercy having landed on a particular world and settled down to be unlikely, based on the fact that it seems that Mercy is kind of continuing to be on the run and afraid. Alright, now we're going to some of the mechanics, so it's going to be dipping into the awakening side of things. So we're going to be talking a lot about breath. There's two main points I'm going to be making about breath in this series, but the first point I'm going to be making is the fact that Vasher's secret might finally have been revealed. Vasher uses perfect pitch, and now we've seen through Navani's experiments and the light that is used on Roshar, void light, stormlight, tower light, war light, all of it can be manipulated and even potentially transformed using tones, the true tones and the mixed tones of Roshar, and I'm guessing the tones of the Cosmere in general. In fact, I would argue that each shard's power has a tone. We might even have seen this when we have the Seekers or MISTBORN who use their pulses to try and find people who are burning elementic metals. They hear rhythms like heartbeats. I imagine that if you could decipher these rhythms more perfectly, like Navani was able to start teaching herself, or how a listener could if they happened to be able to inherit the abilities of a MISTBORN, they likely would be able to hear the resonant tones of the various shards. And for instance, the power and tone of preservation through the beats. Each beat different based on the metal that was born, but each beat a part of a symphony that is this tone, the pure tones of preservation. So, what do we know from this? I believe that Vasher uses his knowledge and perfect pitch to be able to resonate the tones of Roshar into the tone of endowment, who is the one who gave him the power and who gives breath. So, could this produce brand new breath from Stormlight? I'm not too sure, but perhaps it can simply renew breath, giving it life again, so that he does not need to consume new breath every week to keep himself alive. He instead spends every week recharging his breath, which is much, much more efficient and means that the breaths themselves do not have to wither away due to simple attrition. And what top list wouldn't be complete without Nightblood? Oh, Nightblood, he finally did what we were all waiting for. He was able to make a powerful strike, and he actually did something I've been very curious about for a long time. What happens if you hit a shard with Nightblood? Some of us were speculating that it could actually lead to the death and destruction of a shard, and we were partially correct. It does kill the vessel. It does not destroy the power in any way, though it might dissipate the power because it does eat a lot of that power. So it makes me curious whether or not Nightblood is simply another form of what we see Void Light or anti-Void Light being, the anti-matter form of the investiture. Perhaps Nightblood is anti-breath. However, because of the nature of breath and the connection that he can draw with pretty much anybody who comes around him, let alone has to hold him, that he might become a universal anti-investiture, that he gobbles up investiture because the investiture is spent, it seems unlikely that he's simply using it to exist, or it's using it to exist. Forget the pronoun, it's a he or she or whatever. It's not, it's Nightblood. Whatever it is, it seems like Nightblood might be a form of physical anti-investiture, and he can interact with other forms of anti-investiture. So while anti-void light and void light colliding makes an explosion, it seems that there was a potential that anti-void light could be turned into other forms of anti-light or anti-investiture if properly tuned. And so my guess is that Nightblood might be a self-tuning fork, you could say, where he can turn into any type of anti-investiture in order to consume that investiture. But again, this is very much speculation on my part. There's very little evidence to the fact, other than the fact that the way that Nightblood interacts with things that he or she comes in contact with reminds me very heavily of the way anti-void light interacted with void light. Explosive death. Except with Nightblood being able to suck away the energy, it simply turns people to ash. Now, we're going to circle back around to another interesting point. We find out through some of the text, through Hoid's interactions with what the Ghostbloods speak to Shallan, and some of the other whispers towards the end of the book, we learn that the Ghostbloods are heavily interested in the Unmade. We already knew this from the last book. Specifically, we learned that they are interested in Bad Adom-Mishram. Now, Bad Adom-Mishram was the one who was the leader of the False Desolation. While Odium was trapped and away, she stepped up and effectively became a bondsmith in a way for the Fused, allowing them to start transferring over without the need of the Herald's return. However, this led to a great weakness because she was too liberal in bonding with many of the singers. She inadvertently brought about their downfall when she was trapped in a perfect gemstone and robbed them of all their connection, leading them to become the husk-like shells that were the Parshendi. Now, why on earth would Kelsier and the Ghostbloods be interested in Ban Adom-Mishram? Well, we know, as was implied, that Bad Adom-Mishram has an ability to draw deep connections with large groups of people and utilize that connection to do stuff. Granted, for this case, it was helping to ferry over bonding Spren into their gem hearts to give them forms of power and exercise her own control over them. One thing that's a little disheartening and crazy to think about is what on earth could the Ghostbloods do with an ability to connect with large groups of people at the same time. Perhaps there are things that could be done, such as enslaving and influencing a large group of mist wraiths who are intelligent enough but can be easily influenced because of the holes inside of them that allow for Harmony to normally control them. But if potentially those gaps were filled up with something else, another influence that could corrupt their investiture and create a unified force against Harmony, well, perhaps the corrupted influence that I was talking about in my last video and the evidence we saw in Alloy of Law holds more water than I initially even thought, and that the connection wasn't directly to Odium, but instead to a smuggled Unmade that was somehow ferried across the deep, or even just reaches out across the void to utilize the power and corruption to be able to make agents that Harmony cannot see nor detect nor influence. Again, this is very much one of the more speculative ones. However, it does seem odd that they would be interested in a creature that can connect and effectively implant Spren into entities who are, I'm guessing, willing, and then use that connection to forge contracts and control over others. And if Thydekar/Kelsier wants that, and we're seeing such odd things happening on Scadral, the numbers start to add up fairly quickly. And for my number 10 thing you might have missed in Rhythm of War, I'm going to talk about breath. Again, we learned at the very end in the epilogue about the terrifying things that new Odium can do when he interacted with Hoid, editing his memory. Now, we heard confirmed from Brandon later that what exactly happened was a bit of breath surgery, because the breaths we confirmed through Hoid can store memories. Like a copper metal mind, it seems anyone with breath and the know-how can store excess memories inside their breaths for safekeeping and the sake of sanity. This is likely a technique that almost all long-living world hoppers use in one way or another, because breath is a little more accessible than ferochemy via hemalurgy, which is about the only other way they could do it. So it seems very likely that Chris and other long-lived world hoppers have likely been using this method to maintain their sanity, should they choose to. It's just very interesting to know that, and it's something we should be keeping an eye out for, because it's a very important means of understanding, especially with the idea that having extended life is not just simply a pass for all the mental instability that would come with overloaded memory. And before I go, I want to throw in a bit of a bonus one, something that's a lot more speculative but has a lot of substance to it, because there is a partial confirmation on Brandon's part during a Q&A recently. I noticed very early on in the prologue that there was a steward that was working in the palace with Navani. This steward is actually mentioned again in Urithiru a couple of times in passing. It is a steward who is described as having a long white beard and wearing too many rings. I immediately thought, that's an interesting detail to point out. And the first thing I thought of was feruchemy, because feruchemists naturally would be inclined to wear lots and lots of metal on their bodies visibly. Now, what's interesting here is the fact that many people were curious about the red bird that was seen in Urithiru that was being attacked by the Ghostblood's green raptor bird and was helped by Lift. And Brandon himself confirms that the red bird belonged to a feruchemist who was living in Urithiru at the time. Now, why is this important? Well, because it could likely be the same person. I believe that there's a good amount of information available in this book to point us to the steward working for the royal family, now working in Urithiru for Navani, to be a feruchemist. Now, whether this feruchemist is a free-roaming feruchemist, somebody who's like working, maybe a citizen of Silverlight or another organization like the 17th Shard, or perhaps this is literally an agent of Harmony themselves. It does not really matter. I just believe that the steward working under Navani is likely the candidate for the feruchemist who owns the red bird who was being attacked. Now, because it so overtly seems to be here, yet so subtle at the same time, I wonder if book 5 we're going to see a lot more portrayal of this particular steward. For instance, perhaps Harmony will be opening true negotiations during the time of the book, which leads to my ultimate ending theory, which I'm going to leave you with. My endgame theory for book 5. I really want the champions battle to end with a victory on the side of, the Radiants, the good guys. I don't want Dalinar to go. There's a lot more to explore with his character and his powers, but I partially believe that he will fail in the final battle, and that what will happen is that new Odium is going to be a lot more willing to negotiate than old Odium, whilst playing the role of trying to be old Odium, since he's not revealing the newness to everyone quite yet. So I believe that humans are going to be effectively evicted from Roshar, and I think there's a chance that they already have set up a potential ally in order to take in the refugees of humanity from Roshar. I believe Harmony, the perfect candidate to establish a colony of Rosharians on his system. Harmony is one of the most heartfelt, genuine, and just lovely people in the Cosmere in general, and he just seems genuinely interested in reaching out and helping. He'd already agreed with Hoid to help in the situation any way he could within his means. I believe taking in refugees is one such method, and with an entire planet that's been relatively unexplored and relatively unsettled, there would be plenty of space for the Rosharans to live. So I'm guessing that that's going to be the big grand finale of the next book. It's going to be about the eventual exodus of the people of Roshar, and that the next arc of the story will be about them establishing a brand new colony on a new world with new populations and trying to understand how the powers of surge binding can, if they all will, interact with other powers on the other shards. However, we have seen even whispers that Odium feared that other shards would be heavily interested in surge binding once they discovered how it worked and perhaps how accessible it really is. But that's all for now. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed your studiousness, and I hope you're excited because there was so much to explore in this book. This is actually just part 1. I'll have shortly coming another 10 things you might have missed in Rhythm of War, because frankly, there's too much to dive into. But I picked some highlights that I wanted to start us off with, and I hope that you will take the time to subscribe so you can see future Letters from the Cosmere, which is my lore series, future things you might have missed in Rhythm of War and other Cosmere books to come, and some special projects I've got in the works in the next few months that I hope you'll find very digestible and fun in a pure Cosmere channel. So thank you so much for all your attention and your patience. I look forward to reading your comments, and I will try and answer every one of them that comes around. I'd love to answer your questions, and I'd love you to tell me why I'm wrong. So make sure to do all that in the comments below. Look for my other lore videos if you're curious about them, and keep exploring, keep reading, and read and find out. So until the next video you see with me, I'll see you then.